This is Land of Havilah, Leviticus 27, the last chapter of Leviticus. Coming up in this chapter, under the law of Moses, a man could consecrate various things to Yahweh. Verse 1. Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, when a man consecrates a person to Yahweh in a vow, according to your valuation of a male from 20 years old even to 60 years old, shall be 50 shekels of silver after the shekel of the sanctuary. If she's a female, then your valuation shall be 30 shekels. If the person's from 5 years old even to 20 years old, then your valuation shall be for a male 20 shekels and for a female 10 shekels. If the person is from a month old even to 5 years, then your valuation shall be for a male 5 shekels of silver, and for a female your valuation shall be 3 shekels of silver. If the person is from 60 years old and upward, if he's a male, then your valuation shall be 15 shekels, and for a female 10 shekels. But if he's poorer than your valuation, then he shall be set before the priest, and the priest shall assign a value to him. The priest shall assign a value according to his ability to pay." Comment in verse 2, it's not clear what it means to, quote, consecrate a person to Yahweh in a vow, end quote. But it's also translated to make an extraordinary or difficult vow. We might take the incident in the book of Acts, whether or not it's a valid example, of when a group of Jewish men vowed to assassinate the Apostle Paul. They thought they were giving service to God. They, quote, bound themselves under a curse, saying that they would neither eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. Chapter 23, verse 12. Verses 2 through 8 we just read in Leviticus on difficult or extraordinary vows might be the applicable law under which this vow fell. It turned out that in the case of the vow against Paul, that they weren't able to kill him, so to fulfill the vow, those who took it had two other options under the law. They could either withhold food and drink from themselves indefinitely, which they probably didn't do, or they could redeem themselves from the vow by paying 50 shekels of silver to Yahweh, according to verse 3 we just read. Or we could use another possible example, whether or not it's valid, out of 1 Samuel chapter 1. Hannah couldn't get pregnant, so she vowed to Yahweh that if he would give her a son, she would, quote, give him to Yahweh all the days of his life, end quote. This might also be an example of a difficult vow involving a person, as in verse 2. In Hannah's case, she fulfilled the vow by giving Samuel to the high priest. The high priest raised him, and Samuel went on to serve Yahweh full-time all his life. We might also put forth a suggestion that if anyone wished to redeem Samuel from the vow, whether it be his father, mother, Samuel himself, or anyone, they might be able to pay the monetary valuation according to his age in verses 2 to 8 above, which would release him. And we might put forth another example from a passage in Numbers 18, if it's valid, about redeeming firstborn sons. Yahweh said all firstborn sons belong to him, but generally, instead of literally giving the firstborn sons to Yahweh's service, the family redeemed the firstborn when he was a month old by paying the redemption value for him, which was 5 shekels of silver for a 1-month-old. The redemption values weren't based on a person's worth. The idea that a value could be placed on a person is anathema. It seems more based on a person's capacity for labor so that he could redeem himself if necessary. The lower price of redemption for a female, for example, made it easier for a female to redeem herself, which made sense because their capacity to earn a wage was less. The largest redemption amount in verses 2 to 8 above was 50 shekels for a male aged 20 to 60. To give an idea of what 50 shekels was worth, it was the same as the value of a homer of barley in verse 16 below, which is about 6 bushels of barley. So it wasn't out of sight by any means to redeem anyone from a vow. The redemption amount certainly doesn't represent the value of a person in terms of potential labor output, which would be astronomically more. It was simply the amount it took to be released from the vow. Depending on a person's capacity for labor, it was more or less in money. In verse 8, if a poor person wished to be released from a vow and couldn't afford the standard valuation, the priest could give him a break on the amount. This all underscored the seriousness and gravity of a vow in the eyes of God. A person better guard his lips because, quote, when a man vows a vow to Yahweh or swears an oath to bind his soul with a bond, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. Numbers 30, verse 2. If it turns out a person couldn't fulfill his vow, to get him out of hot water with Yahweh, he needed to redeem himself with money, if we're reading this passage correctly. Probably much better to fulfill the vow by accomplishing the terms of it, rather than breaking the vow and having to redeem oneself from it. Probably a person incurred guilt if he failed to fulfill it, and it was an embarrassing situation if he had to redeem himself from it. Because of the difficulties in fulfilling a vow, Jesus basically said it's usually a bad idea to make a vow in the first place. Matthew 5:33-37. Coming up, procedures for giving an animal to Yahweh. The giver will hand it over to the custody of the priest or Levites. As we know, a person can bring an animal to the door of the tent of meeting for sacrifice, but coming up, he can also give animals to the priests and Levites as a form of donation to be used for whatever. Verse 9. If it is an animal of which men offer an offering to Yahweh, all that any man gives of such to Yahweh becomes holy. He shall not alter it nor change it, a good for a bad or a bad for a good. And if he shall at all change animal for animal, then both it and that for which it's changed shall be holy. Comment: for just one example, a man might dedicate all the offspring of a certain female animal to Yahweh. Whether the offspring are born lame or sound, he shouldn't switch them out for different animals. Coming up, if an animal was the ceremonially unclean type, such as a donkey, for example, a person could still donate it. Verse 11. If it's any unclean animal of which they do not offer as an offering to Yahweh, then he shall set the animal before the priest, and the priest shall value it, whether it is good or bad. As you, the priest, value it, so shall it be. But if he will indeed redeem it, then he shall add the fifth part of it to its valuation. Comment: the giver will present the animal to the priest, probably with no intention of ever asking it back, but just in case he changes his mind, he can give the priest the value of the animal, which the priest will determine by examining the animal up front, plus 20%. That's the redemption of it. Now on to giving a house to Yahweh, which works exactly the same. Verse 14. When a man dedicates his house to be holy to Yahweh, then the priest shall evaluate it, whether it's good or bad. As the priest shall evaluate it, so shall it stand. If he who dedicates it will redeem his house, then he shall add the fifth part of the money of your valuation to it, and it shall be his. Comment: a person can give his house to Yahweh if he's willing to either give it as a permanent gift or willing to redeem it for its value plus 20%. Now 9 verses on the ins and outs of giving land to Yahweh. Verse 16. If a man dedicates to Yahweh part of the field of his possession, then your valuation shall be according to the seed for it. The sowing of a homer of barley shall be valued at 50 shekels of silver. If he dedicates his field from the year of Jubilee, according to your valuation it shall stand. But if he dedicates his field after the Jubilee, then the priest shall reckon to him the money according to the years that remain to the year of Jubilee, and an abatement shall be made from your valuation. If he who dedicated the field will indeed redeem it, then he shall add the fifth part of the money of your valuation to it, and it shall remain his. If he will not redeem the field, or if he sold the field to another man, it shall not be redeemed any more. But the field, when it goes out in the Jubilee, shall be holy to Yahweh as a devoted field. It shall be owned by the priests. If he dedicates a field to Yahweh which he's bought, which is not of the field of his possession, then the priest shall reckon to him the worth of your valuation up to the year of Jubilee, and he shall give your valuation on that day as a holy thing to Yahweh. In the year of Jubilee the field shall return to him from whom it was bought, even to him to whom the possession of the land belongs. Comment: when Israel conquers the Promised Land, they'll assign land by tribe and family. The land assigned to a family is called their inheritance. The idea is that they inherited the land from Yahweh, and they'll keep inheriting the land as the years go by it being passed down within the family. If any of the family members sell their land, the family will get it back at Jubilee. This was all in the Law of Jubilee in chapter 25. Now, regarding a person's inheritance of land, if he wanted to dedicate a field or part of a field to Yahweh, the priest will look at it up front and assign a market value to it, according to how much barley it would take to sow it, 50 shekels per homer of barley. In other words, the valuation will be based on the size of the field and on whether it's suitable for growing grain. In verses 17 to 19, as the years go by, the priest will adjust the valuation of the field according to how many crops are left on it until the year of Jubilee. The redemption amount for the land shall be the valuation of it at the time of its redemption plus 20%. Like any redemption, anyone looking to redeem it would probably get a better deal on another piece of land somewhere, because redemption of anything costs 20% more than what the item's worth. In verses 20 to 21, when Jubilee arrives, the original owner or his family won't get the field back unless they've redeemed it at some point, or if they redeem it and turn around and sell it, they won't get it back at Jubilee. It becomes the priest's permanent property at Jubilee. In verses 22 to 24, if a person buys a field that's not part of his family land, he can dedicate it to Yahweh. The priest will set the redemption value according to the usual method, but the twist is that the land will return to the original family at Jubilee, because when the family sold it, it was with the understanding that Jubilee would return it to them. Coming up, when Yahweh says shekel, what shekel is he talking about? Verse 25. All your valuation shall be according to the shekel of the sanctuary, 20 gerahs to the shekel. Comment. In the next verse, back to the giving of animals, the firstborn male to every female animal belongs to Yahweh anyway, as Yahweh already said in Exodus 13:2 and 15. Therefore, a person can't give a firstborn animal. They're not his to give. They belong to Yahweh. Verse 26. Only the firstborn among animals, which is made Yahweh's firstborn, no man may dedicate, whether an ox or a sheep. It's Yahweh's. Comment. Coming up, the firstborn males from the wombs of ceremonially unclean animals, such as donkeys and camels, belong to Yahweh as well. The owner can retain ownership if he presents money to redeem the animal, which will be the value of it plus 20%. Basically, he has to purchase the animal from Yahweh, or he can sell the animal and donate the proceeds to Yahweh. Verse 27. If it's an unclean animal, then he shall buy it back according to your valuation and shall add the fifth part to it, or if it isn't redeemed, then it shall be sold according to your valuation. Comment. Now a different category of more extreme giving, called to devote in the next verse, which means to permanently dedicate with no option of redemption. Verse 28. Notwithstanding no devoted thing that a man shall devote to Yahweh of all that he has, whether of man or animal or of the field of his possession, shall be sold or redeemed. Everything devoted to destruction is most holy to Yahweh. Comment. The devoted thing might be destroyed to Yahweh, for example, by burning it to Yahweh, or at least the owner will forfeit all use and possession of it without the chance of redemption. Coming up, devoting a person to destruction, verse 29. No one devoted who shall be devoted from among men shall be ransomed. He shall surely be put to death. Comment. The devoted person, quote, shall surely be put to death, end quote. How can that be? We remember that Yahweh commanded Abraham to offer Isaac, but he stopped him from going through with it. And we remember that God, throughout Leviticus, was very specific about the sacrificial offerings that Israel should bring. Only cattle, sheep, goats, turtle doves, and pigeons should be sacrificed. Human sacrifice was not an option. A human sacrifice would be completely unauthorized. Depending on how we read Judges chapter 11, it seems that Jephthah might have offered his daughter as a burnt offering, but if he did, it was out of complete ignorance to the law. So what did Yahweh intend when he said in verse 29 that anyone devoted among men shall not be ransomed but surely be put to death? He was talking about war, for one. At times he'll command that Israel should put to death by war everyone in certain cities, such as he commanded them at Jericho, Joshua 6:17. And secondly, in putting to death of a person in verse 29, Yahweh is referring to persons condemned to capital punishment for some crime they've committed. Criminals facing the death sentence shall not be ransomed, but surely be put to death, he's saying. As he reemphasized in Numbers 35:31, quote, you shall not take ransom for the life of a murderer who's guilty of death, but he shall surely be put to death, end quote. Verse 30. All the tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or of the fruit of the trees, is Yahweh's. It's holy to Yahweh. If a man redeems anything of his tithe, he shall add a fifth part to it. All the tithe of the herds or the flocks, whatever passes under the rod, the tenth shall be holy to Yahweh. He shall not search whether it's good or bad, neither shall he change it. If he changes it at all, then both it and that for which it's changed shall be holy. It shall not be redeemed. Comment: Israel is already familiar with the tithe, such as when Abraham gave a tenth of all to Melchizedek, Genesis 14:20, and when Jacob vowed a tenth of all to Yahweh if he would take care of him on his journey, Genesis 28:22. In verse 30, Yahweh introduced tithing in the law of Moses for the first time. The tithes connected to the land in verse 30 because without land, the people have no crops or increase with which to tithe. In verses 30 to 33, the tithe shall apply to all agricultural products, including livestock. In verses 32 and 33, the owner shall determine animals for the tithe by making them pass under the rod. Every 10th animal under the rod shall be Yahweh's, regardless of fitness. In the New Testament, the nearest thing to a tithing commandment is probably 2 Corinthians 9:7, quote, "Let each man give according as he has determined in his heart, not grudgingly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver," end quote. Now the last verse of Leviticus, verse 34. These are the commandments which Yahweh commanded Moses for the children of Israel on Mount Sinai. Comment in verse 27, Yahweh gave these commandments to Moses on Mount Sinai, but that should probably be translated at Mount Sinai, because in the first verse of the book, Yahweh was speaking from the tent of meeting, which was at, not on, the mountain. The book of Numbers picks up where Leviticus left off. Yahweh will command Israel to break camp with the intention of leading them on an 11-day trip from Mount Sinai to the edge of Canaan, Deuteronomy 1:2, but it'll take a lot longer than that because of Israel's faithlessness. Pray with me, please. Father, thank you for the sacrifice of your Son, which you foreshadowed in Genesis. Thank you also for the phrases, "He shall be clean," and "She shall be clean," end quote, "so that you may be accepted," end quote, which we know applies to everyone with faith in your Son. And thank you for proving yourself in black and white. In Jesus' name, amen.